We'll get going this morning. So we're going to do a study of Matthew chapter 24, and it'd probably benefit us to go ahead and go through Matthew chapter 25 also, because Matthew 25 continues the thought process of what Matthew 24 leaves on. So fall of the Jewish nation and the final judgment when we're looking at both of these chapters as we go through them. So, right off the bat, as we enter into Matthew chapter 24, we have the first two verses here that says, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." So Jesus is making these statements, but what we have to consider is the connection of what the previous chapter left off at. So in the previous chapter, Matthew 23, verse 36, there's a statement made by Jesus, "Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation." So the context is very critical when we study the Bible. The statement in verse 2 is spawning off of the statements made back in the previous chapter in verse 36. Except in verse 2 of Matthew 24, it's becoming more specifically identified with this temple that's going to be destroyed. So Matthew 23 sets up the context of this judgment. And all of this, if you're familiar with Matthew 23, Jesus is laying it on thick of woe unto the scribes and the Pharisees, basically, for their spiritual failure. In other words, they were a bunch of hypocrites. They were binding things on others that they themselves would not follow. So they would make it harder on others than what they're even willing to do themselves. And Jesus is calling them out on the hypocrisy. Matter of fact, in verse 26 of Matthew 23, Jesus says, "Thou blind Pharisees, cleanse first that which is within the cup and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye are like unto the whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are with full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. Even so ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity." So Jesus is very disappointed with the hypocrisy going on in the amongst the people that should be faithful, that should be righteous, but instead these scribes and Pharisees, they're nothing but a bunch of hypocrites pretending to be righteous. So the temple, when we think about Jerusalem and the temple in the first century, the temple was really the heart of this Jewish nation. I mean, that was a very important building for them. That's where all of their worship took place. That's where all the people would go to. And this is a big deal to them for a statement to be made that it's going to be destroyed and tore down. Jesus is talking about the Jewish nation and the signs that will enable people to know when the Roman army was going to overrun it. And this is where a lot of confusion comes in when folks study Matthew 24. They fail to take the context of chapter 23, and they fail to connect that in with the beginning of chapter 24 as to what Jesus is even talking about and why he's talking about it. So we have some signs for the people that we're going to be digging into here that Jesus is going to lay out. He's going to lay out these signs basically for those who are faithful followers, who want to live right. These are signs that they can escape these events that are about to happen. The upcoming disasters that's about to take place in Jerusalem, on this temple that's being discussed. In the very next verse, in verse 3, it says, "And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying," so they came to him in private, and they're asking some questions here. They say, "Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" So let's think about these questions. Jesus is going to announce what would take place in connection with the signs that they're asking about, the signs that would lead up to the coming judgment that he's going to be discussing, the judgment of this Jewish nation, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction that took place in AD 70. Jesus is going to lay out some signs to answer the question that's at hand. In the very next couple verses, Jesus answered and said unto them, "Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." So let's think about this. Verse 3, when we look at this verse, the disciples are privately asking Jesus about the timing and signs of two major events in this verse: the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the world. This sets the stage as we go forward for Jesus to describe what will happen before the coming judgment of the Jewish nation, the destruction of Jerusalem. He's going to answer their questions. Verses 4 and 5 that I have up here, Jesus warns them to be cautious, don't be deceived. Just like now, in today's time, when things are getting real crazy, when people are getting beat down, this is the opportunity for these false teachers to sneak on in and start deceiving people and putting doubt in their minds. He predicts that many will come claiming to be Christ and will deceive many people. This is going to be such an event, such a catastrophe, that Jerusalem, of all cities, the temple of all places, was going to be destroyed, that this event was going to cause many to be deceived into thinking that surely Christ has come back. This is the end. This is the end of times, and people were going to trick themselves, and people were going to run around claiming that they are the Christ, in which Jesus is going to touch on that again here in a little bit as we get further into this. So, Jesus realized the danger of them being deceived. This was a big deal. These questions that are being asked in verse 3 are not simple questions. These are loaded questions. Tell us when these things will be. What shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? These are major questions that his disciples are asking. In verse 6, "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." So here as we look at this, the end of the Jewish state is not yet. Jesus speaks of persecution, how false prophets will arise, how iniquity will abound. All these things are going to take place in this judgment For the nation shall rise against nation, the kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Now this is where people can really get off base. When you start getting into the signs. Beginning of sorrows, in other words, pain, sorrow, travail, a pang of throe, especially of childbirth. So the part that people get confused on when we get into Matthew 24 is they get confused on what's actually being discussed here in the beginning of this chapter. Now, there's going to be some people who are going to say, well, this is the true signs of the end of that old covenant. They're going to say, this shows that everything was fulfilled back in AD 70. But it's not. That's not what's being discussed. So, when we're talking about the Jewish state, and then we're talking about the old covenant, okay? Jewish state, Old Covenant. Okay, they're related but not the same. So the Jewish state refers to the nation of Israel as basically a social entity, especially during the time of Jesus. Jerusalem as its capital, their political entity, their government, their temple as their religious center. This is the Jewish state. And then you had the Old Covenant. Okay, this is what some folks say, that this is truly when that Old Covenant ended and the new one was fully risen and into effect. Well, the Old Covenant is basically an agreement that God made with His people through Moses. And this covenant included the law, the religious practices, sacrifices, and how their relationship should be between God and Israel. So, when we're going into Matthew 24, we have to know what we're talking about and what we're reading about. We're not reading about the ending of the old covenant in this chapter. What we're reading about is a judgment on the Jewish state itself, the nation and its people. Okay? That's what's being discussed here. That's the destruction that's going to take place. That's what the signs are leading up to, so that the people who are faithful and want to survive and get through this, they'll see it coming and they can protect themselves and endure it till the end. So, the end of the Jewish state, such as the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, marked the end of its national religious structure. The Old Covenant, that was nailed to the cross when Jesus died and was sacrificed. So let's keep that straight in our minds so we don't get confused as to what's being discussed here. So he goes on to say, then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, shall kill you, ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Then shall many be offended, shall betray one another, shall hate one another. Many false prophets shall rise, many shall deceive many, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that endure unto the end shall be saved. So again, we have to slow down with the context of what's being discussed. Because we have some words that can mean different things when you look at them. But these words have to flow with the context of the conversation. So here we have in verse 13, the comment is made, but he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. So let's remember, he's talking about the signs and the upcoming destruction that's going to happen. Under the situation that they lived, you had all these people that should have been faithful unto God, all the way back with the beginning of the church, all the way until now, they're facing this ultimate judgment because of their spiritual failures. The scribes and the Pharisees were hypocrites. It was all show. They were ugly on the inside. Many of them failed to endure. And God is not happy with how this is going. The Hebrew letter discussed this very thing. They were turning back from the church and going back down to the temple. This is one of the biggest issues that the people had back in this time. They were wanting to go back to that old law and that old way. They wanted to go back to the Jewish ways of worship. And they were getting away from the way Christ taught and the way that worship should be in His church, the Christian age. So this is a big issue here that the people were having. The end being discussed in verse 13 is referring to the end of the Jewish state that we were talking about a minute ago. It was going to be a destruction of Jerusalem. They were having issues. They wanted to go back. Well, the temple is going to be destroyed. The city, the holy city, it's going to be destroyed. There's going to be a judgment. The word saved doesn't always reference spiritual salvation like we most of the time use it. But the nation of Israel, just like the nation of Israel was saved from Egyptian bondage, it was a physical deliverance. So Jesus is saying, they asked the question, remember they asked the question, when are these things going to happen? What signs are there going to be? And Jesus is laying it out to them as to what's taking place. If they could get through this, take the signs that He's laying out for the truth, then they would endure to the end. They would be saved when it was all said and done from this destruction and pain and anguish. The language here is in reference to deliverance in relationship to the problem concerning the fall of the Jewish nation. If you guys believe what I'm saying, Jesus says, you take these signs serious, you be watchful, then yes, you can endure to the end, and you can be saved from this destruction. So, in summary, Jesus warns of the coming trials for His followers, emphasizing the need for endurance. The end refers to the destruction of Jerusalem, and saved points to deliverance from the catastrophe at hand. The passage encourages steadfast faith, even when all others are falling away and returning to the old ways. That's why He's harping so bad on these false prophets that are going to come in verse 11. He doesn't want those who are trying their best to get through this, He doesn't want them to be deceived and to follow after them. He wants them to endure strong in the faith. And then in verse 14 it says, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." So let's think about this verse. This is an interesting verse here. So we just read in verse 13, "He that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved." And we say we're talking about them who are going to endure through this destruction that the Romans are coming in to put on Jerusalem. And then in the very next verse, the statement's made, And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. So what are we talking about here? It is this gospel concerning Christ and His announcement concerning the fall of the Jewish nation that shall be preached as a witness to all nations. Now, this has a significant importance for what's taking place here. Okay, He's telling them what's to come. He's laying out the signs that are going to lead up to this event that at this point hasn't taken place yet. This truth that's being presented is going to be so powerful in confirming who Jesus is even more as far as His deity. So that when this event happens, the very record that Jesus gave will be a testimony to His deity and of all He claimed to be. Remember, the Jews had some issues with accepting the fact that Jesus was truly that Son of God. They were always stirring the pot, trying to get people to come back to the Jewish way, which is why Jesus is laying it out. Y'all need to be careful. There's going to be a lot of false prophets when all this is taking place. But because this takes place and because Jesus was able to tell it beforehand, all of this is a testimony that He is indeed that Son of God. So the fulfillment of this prophecy, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, okay, that's what we're leading up to, would not only validate Jesus' words, but it serves as a historical witness that's going to go down in the books to His deity for all who hear the gospel. All of this further enforces the power of the gospel. And then in verse 15 it goes into saying, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand." So let's go to this prophecy, and we're going to spend some time here in this prophecy, and I'm pretty sure we got time to go through this. We're going to go through this prophecy that Daniel laid out back in Daniel chapter 9, starting in verse 23. So let's see here. Would anyone mind reading this? Verse 23 through 27. Okay.
23 through 27. At the beginning of thy supplications, the commandment came forth, and I am come to show thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore understand the matter and consider the vision. 70 weeks is determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate.
Okay, so we have the prophecy recorded by Daniel, And then again in verse 15 here in Matthew 24, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. So I think it's very important for us to understand exactly what the prophecy said and what this now means and why Jesus is bringing this up for these folks here in Matthew 24. So the first verse there that you read, Mark, says 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, to make the end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. A lot of things being talked about in this one verse here. So upon thy people and upon thy holy city. Anyone know who we're talking about here? Who's the people? What's the holy city? 70-week prophecy. Daniel's people, the Jews, the holy city, Jerusalem. Daniel is seeing the complete time of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. The 70 weeks are a figure and not to be understood literally. So it's not literally 70 weeks from the time that Daniel documented this prophecy. That's figurative, not literal. The 70 weeks term seems to indicate completeness. It's a symbol for completeness. Daniel seeing the remainder of the time that the Jews would truly exist, the nation, the state of the Jews. And Jesus is saying back here in verse 15, he's saying, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So one of the things we're going to get into is we're going to have to understand, what is this abomination of desolation? What is this that Daniel was prophesying about? And that's why we have to dig into these verses a little deeper to get an understanding here. So, verse 24 in Daniel contains 6 actions. 6 actions. That's why I said this verse contained a whole lot of information. To finish the transgression, to make end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and then to anoint the most holy. So to understand why Jesus is bringing this up means we need to understand what all is being discussed here. So to finish the transgression, which is one of the first actions that's being discussed, Gabriel revealed to Daniel that their transgression was not yet complete. More transgression would come in the future. In their part in the crucifixion of the Messiah, their iniquity would be finished. They had killed their own Messiah to finish the transgression. They killed their own Messiah. In that death, he made possible the forgiveness they needed for that sin. Of all things for them to finally do is that they killed the very Messiah they had been waiting on and talking about. By doing that, Jesus, in his death, again, made it possible for the forgiveness of sin as well as all other sins they had committed. So, to finish the transgression, they killed the very Messiah they're waiting on. To make an end of sin in his death at Golgotha, Jesus paid the price required for sin. The death of Jesus for the guilt of the sinner. Now remember, the events in Daniel that's being prophesied about is the events that's building up to the destruction of the city and the people, the temple, that state, that nation. So he's building it up in this prophecy. So these events are going in line. Jesus paid the price required for sin. Daniel made a comment in verse 24 to make the end of sin. Well, Jesus is definitely doing that. Jesus died so we, through his forgiveness, would not have to die eternally. Through Jesus, we are freed from sin, which is fulfilling to make the end of sin. Then Daniel makes another statement, another action, to make atonement for iniquity. When Christ died and rose again, he atoned for the sins of the world. Yet another event that took place. And again, Jesus is bringing this up. Remember the prophecy that Daniel laid out. He's bringing it up. This is part of the prophecy. Christ died and rose again. He atoned for the sins of the world. Reconciliation was made possible through his death. And that brings us to another action that Daniel laid out to bring in everlasting righteousness. So we've seen it so far. We're going through the different points of what Daniel laid out in his prophecy. The next point is to bring in everlasting righteousness. The righteousness comes from the willing sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. Daniel is prophesying about the events that's going to come in the future, and he even prophesied about the very event of how they're going to kill their own Messiah that they've been looking for. Now, how sad is that? The next action in this verse, to seal up vision and prophecy. The Old Testament prophecy regarding Christ and his kingdom completed the plan of God had for his people. Okay? Christ came on the scene. He was crucified. He died, he was buried, and he rose again. God put his seal on biblical prophecy. The prophecy concerning the Messiah that they were waiting on, all of that was fulfilled. He did come just like God promised. He did come to save the people from their sins, to anoint the most holy place. If the phrase designates a place, it must be the sanctuary in Jerusalem, while the old sanctuary, holy place, was to be destroyed. The Holy Spirit would come upon the new temple, Christ's church, making it the most holy place. Remember, the ultimate plan was for Christ's law to come into effect. He nailed the old law to the cross. So going back, looking at that verse 24, in Daniel's prophecy, it starts off, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. And then he went through all the actions that took place, finishing the transgression, making an end of the sins, make reconciliation for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up the vision and prophecy, and anoint the most holy. And we briefly went through each of those points. And now we have verse 25 in Daniel. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks. So we have a 70-week prophecy. 7 weeks and 62 weeks, the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. So remember, Daniel was in Babylonian captivity. So the people were still wanting to get out of that exile. This passage tells us the beginning point and the ending point of the time for the first 69 weeks. So let's think about that. 7 weeks, 62 weeks, the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. The 70 weeks time begins with the going forth of the commandment to rebuild Jerusalem, which came from Cyrus back in 539 BC. And we don't have to read these, but these are verses you can jot down if you want to read the history of that. Ezra 1, 1 through 8, Ezra 5, 13 through 17, chapter 6, verse 3, and even in Isaiah 44 and verse 28, you can read about the rebuilding and the people going back. So verse 25, again, let's not lose sight. The beginning point and the ending point of time for the first 69 weeks. 69 of the 70 weeks are given from the rebuilding of Jerusalem after Babylonian captivity until the coming of the Messiah, the Prince, around AD 30. And Christ is now saying in Matthew 24, remember these prophecies that Daniel laid out. I mean, you guys, you hypocrites, you scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you non-believers, here's what's about to take place to your precious temple, your building, your city. And remember what Daniel prophesied about, the abomination of desolation. So we're starting to understand a little bit now. Daniel goes on to say, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince shall come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. After the 69 weeks, from 539 BC up to AD 30, sometime within the 70th week, from AD 30 to AD 70, sometime within this, the Messiah would be cut off. This harmonizes well with the fact that the sacrifices would cease in the midst of the 70th week. So let's think about that. The Messiah would be cut off sometime within the 70th week. It was Christ's death in the middle of the AD 30 to AD 70 period that would remove the old law. Okay? Colossians 2:14, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. The crucifixion of Christ must be kept in view when we're talking about the 70 weeks that are prophesied by Daniel, especially combining that in with Christ, using it as a reference, as he's also discussing the upcoming destruction on Jerusalem. He's using it for a reason. In that same verse, people of the prince shall destroy the city. Let's look at that. There is mention of a prince. So when you look at history, Titus, the Roman commander, that will be coming against the city, Jerusalem, to destroy and to bring it about, abomination of desolation, which is the verse we're talking about in Matthew 24:15. All of this is historically documented and proven. This is an event that Jesus in verse 15 is telling the people is going to happen. And even Daniel was prophesying about it taking place. The abomination of desolation, the destruction that's going to take place. And we can connect the dots to the city being talked about, the prince that's being talked about that's going to come in and actually place this judgment. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation. In Matthew 24:15, Christ is discussing the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Daniel's prophecy fulfilled this event. The abomination of desolation is the destruction of the city and the temple that's going to take place. Daniel 24 through 27 was to show the end of the Jews in Jerusalem. It was in AD 70 that this end was to come, this end of the Jewish state. All of what they were going around and claiming to be, all that was going to come to an end. That was going to be destroyed. There is mention of a prince. We talked about Titus coming against the city, Jerusalem. You know, Titus, Caesar, not even going to try that, Vespes, whatever. Anyway, Titus was recorded to come in and actually be the commander of this army. Before becoming emperor, Titus regained renown as a military commander, serving under his father in Judea during the First Jewish-Roman War. The campaign came to a brief halt with the death of Emperor Nero in 68, launching Vespasian's bid for imperial power during the year of the four emperors. When Vespasian was declared emperor on July 1st, 69, Titus was left in charge of ending the Jewish rebellion. He was going to end it. In 70, he besieged and captured Jerusalem and destroyed the city. For this achievement, Titus was awarded a triumph which still exists today. The Ark of Titus commemorates his victory to this day. This is historical documentation that Titus indeed was the one who came in, and that the city was indeed destroyed in AD 70. And all of this flows with exactly what Jesus is talking about. He says, do you not remember the prophecy spoken by Daniel? And here we have, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Christ was going to confirm the covenant for the 70th week. This is the new covenant that he was a mediator of. It was Christ's death, cutting off in the midst of the week, that would cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. And just like we read before, Colossians 2:14, it was nailed to the cross. The fall of the city of Jerusalem in AD 70 was the abomination of desolation that Jesus says in Matthew 24:15, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. And that's where he's going to get into some more specific signs. Some more signs to where when you read them and you think about them, You can't connect it with the end of the world. Why would you need to flee into the mountains? Why would you be worried if it was snowing? Why would you be worried if it was on the Sabbath day? And we'll get into that on the next class. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem that's going to happen in AD 70. And these are signs for those who want to follow faithfully and get through it and endure to the end. Just like he said in verse 13. He that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. You can make it through this. Not everybody's got to die in this. And this truth of the kingdom, this gospel of the kingdom, this is going to be taught amongst the world. Everybody's going to know that Jesus was the Son of God, and He laid out the events that were going to take place, and they did indeed take place. So, Matthew 24:15, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, Christ refers to the prophecy of Daniel, that prophecy concerning the Roman powers overrunning the Jewish nation. Why such a major judgment on the Jewish people? They crucified Christ and had become an abomination in the eyes of God. They were hypocrites. God's judgment was brought upon the Jewish nation because they had crucified His Son. They had refused the gospel, thereby the desolation of abomination. The desolation of that city was because that city had become an abomination in the sight of God. Spiritually, they were terrible. They were awful. Their inward mans were ugly. God saw it. Christ pointed it out. And now the prophecy that Daniel put out will be fulfilled. So, I don't really want to go any further than that. Next class, we're going to get in talking about some of these signs of fleeing to the mountains, and we'll talk a little bit more detail about all that as we lead up to this destruction of Jerusalem. So at this time, any questions or comments? If we don't have any, we'll end class.